So we just had the US Grand Prix. It's come and gone. It was a great race. It was a thrilling race. There was lots of action all the way up and down the grid. It could have been a feel-good story, a good race that offered a lot of action. And I thought it was still an enjoyable event, but a late penalty for Lando Norris seems to really have stuck in the side of a lot of people who were watching the race, especially a lot of Lando Norris fans, especially a lot of the British media, who I love to remind everybody, love to defend everybody British. And I don't want to say they're biased against everybody else, but boy, they really love defending their boys. So, unfortunately, instead of talking about a great 1-2 result for Ferrari, we're here talking about what is going on? Why are the British boys getting penalties? So there's this video from the race, and I often play videos from the race. I think they make good stuff. They're usually quite reasonable, and I usually turn to them as the voice of reason. But this video has popped up, their thumbnails, stupid rules. How stupid F1 rules ruined a brilliant Verstappen-Norris battle. So let's have a quick look. Tell me what you make of it.
A beautiful piece of motorsport that was interfered with inappropriately. We've slightly adjusted McLaren team boss Andrea Stella's quote there, and we're using it to make a slightly different point to him as well.
So, I mean, straight off the bat, I was like, what do you mean interfered with? Bit bias, but they're like, hey, in our defense, yes, that's bias, but in our defense, that's what the McLaren guy said. Like, well, yeah, but you don't have to repeat everything that everybody says. You get to make your own argument here. But I don't know what the opposite of asking questions is while still insinuating things, but they're doing that.
Unlike Stella, we're not necessarily taking issue with the decision that was made by the
Good. End of video. 15 seconds in. This is a short one today.
stewards regarding Lando Norris's late race pass on Max Verstappen at the US Grand Prix. Regardless of what you think about who was at fault, if anyone, the real problem that was exposed here was that F1's recent attempts to tightly regulate wheel-to-wheel racing are failing.
Ooh. Do you think this is escalating or de-escalating, the panic around this?
Understandably, the Red Bull position on this was a straightforward one, presenting the argument that the rules are clear and Norris breached them, so the penalty was fair. But it's easy to take that view when you're the side benefiting from it. Any team would do the same in that position.
So far, no problem. Norris clearly broke the rules, and Red Bull agrees, but of course it's easy to agree when you're in the right.
Just as understandable was McLaren's view that Norris ended up off the track because the car he was trying to pass on the outside not only forced him out there, but also went outside track limits itself. Before we go any further, let's explain the key points outlined by the stewards.
The only valid part of this is the idea that Verstappen himself went off track. Now, the penalty wasn't you left the track. The penalty was you overtook while off the track, and everybody knows you can't do that. Everybody knows you just cannot do that.
Stewards in their decision to give Norris a 5-second penalty that cost him a podium finish. They said that because Norris was not level.
Very helpful here. Here's the apex. For anyone who hasn't seen it, let's just go through it. The argument was Norris is trying to overtake around the outside and Verstappen is on the inside. And because Verstappen's nose was ahead of Norris's nose at this line, the apex, the middle of the corner, then therefore, if Norris is overtaking and he's on the outside, he is not entitled to any space on the outside, which is to say that if Verstappen wants to use the entire width of the track, he is entitled to, and he cannot be penalized for that. That is literally why when Norris went around Verstappen and he said, well, I was off the track only because he pushed me off, it does not matter. Because Norris was off track, because that's where you go when you're overtaking around the outside and you're behind at the apex.
With Verstappen at the apex of the corner, which we can clearly see was the case from the TV footage, Norris had therefore lost the right to the corner. That meant he was not entitled to gain an advantage once he went off track, seemingly even if he was forced out there by the car on his inside.
Yeah, 100% correct. That's the ruling the stewards gave. You were on the outside, doesn't matter why you were out there, you were on the outside and then you overtook. Penalty. Slam dunk.
However, the stewards only gave a 5-second penalty instead of 10 because Norris had little alternative other than to leave the track due to the proximity of Verstappen's car, and at this point they also acknowledged that Verstappen went off track too.
I've seen so much made of this. The stewards even admit that Verstappen went off track. That's why they reduced Norris's penalty. If what Verstappen did was penalty worthy, he would have gotten the penalty. This isn't a case where they're penalising both drivers, but they're penalising Norris a little bit more. That's not what's happening here. I mean, I've never seen so many people get so mad because the stewards were light on somebody.
But it would appear that as the defending car, Verstappen was allowed to leave the track and maintain his position. Earlier in the race, George Russell and Yuki Tsunoda picked up penalties for forcing another car off track when making passes down the inside at the same corner, even if they didn't go off track themselves.
So this is interesting. And I mean, it's not very often that we get to see so many overtakes at the exact same part of the track in so many different ways. And it allows us to compare lots of different incidents and scrutinize the actual rules and why one driver is found at fault in one situation and another is found at fault in another situation. The George Russell one I think is very interesting because it looks to me as if George Russell is not ahead at the apex and he's going up the inside. Now, if you're going up the inside and you're not ahead at the apex, you don't get to just close the door on the exit of the corner because you're not entitled to that. So that is why he got a penalty against Bottas. That was the penalty that Toto Wolff called a joke. That was the penalty that he was so furious about at the end. George Russell, you'll remember, is a good British boy.
So what this appears to boil down to is that F1's current racing rules are weighted heavily in favour of the car being overtaken, regardless of if they are on the inside or the outside.
See, this is what drives me crazy about this kind of analysis, is that it's not doing anything really to de-escalate the passions that are out there that are overflowing right now. It's basically saying, we're not mad at the drivers, we're not mad at the team principals, we're not even mad at the stewards, but the rules are wrong, the rules are broken. Now, the problem with the rules is that the rules are there to facilitate good racing, and what makes good racing is determined by us. The thing is, this is a bit of a flashpoint. Now, I mean, we've had flashpoints before. There was a flashpoint not that long ago about track limits. Now, week in, week out, most people have no problem with track limits. It's only when, Lewis Hamilton loses his position on a podium because he gets a penalty for exceeding track limits excessively. And they're like, what is this? What even is this rule? Oh, the rule must be broken. Now, the rules can be changed. The rules are there to facilitate good racing. And if everybody kind of agrees this is not good racing, then we can change the rules. That's fine. But as long as the rules are clear and everybody understands them, that's fine. I actually haven't really heard that many people, like Lando Norris hasn't come out and said, that was absolutely outrageous, that decision. I mean, if anybody, he's mad at his team. Lando Norris, if anybody, is mad at his team for not telling him, hey, I wasn't ahead at the apex. Why didn't you tell me? Because I would have given the position back and I wouldn't have got a penalty and I might have even had a chance of overtaking him again. So look, what annoys me about this analysis is that it doesn't actually calm people down by explaining why what happened. What it's doing is saying, you're angry, your anger is justified, and the problem is the rules. And I've seen a lot of this actually online going even one step further and saying, we should be angry at the FIA. We should be mad at the FIA here because they're playing favourites. Toto Wolff is saying the same thing about the stewards, that they're biased in favour of Max Verstappen, presumably. And I just think that this is not productive or positive. And I think we should be actually just taking a moment, especially days later, as we're watching replays and comparing incidents and rereading rules, just calming things down a little bit, listening to what the stewards are saying, and if we genuinely see inconsistencies, that's fine. The George Russell incident and the Norris-Verstappen incident are not the same. So instead of pointing that out and making that clear, they're saying, why is it this rule here and that rule there?
If you're defending on the inside, you're allowed to run deep into the corner and go off track on the exit, and the car battling on your outside must stay behind you. But if someone is attacking you on the inside, all you need to do is stay far enough alongside to be able to claim you are forced off, and again, the overtake on you is illegal. F1's new racing guidelines were supposed to evolve the judgments around these marginal moves to get away from the simple who was ahead at the apex, as that was deemed an oversimplification that encouraged people to overdrive on the way into a corner on the assumption that simply being in front in a freeze frame taken at the apex would entitle them to do whatever they wanted.
So Jensen Button was making this point after the race as well, saying, look, one of the problems with the ruling and the rule the way it is now is that if you're on the inside and you're being overtaken around the outside, all you've got to do is just be very late on the brakes, make sure you're in front of the apex, and just position your car in front at the apex. And then that way, it doesn't matter what happens on the exit, especially if it's not going to be applied if you go off track. But I think there is actually a difference. I think there is actually a case to be made that yes, somebody just doing a wild defensive move like that, it should be pretty obvious when you see it. And again, a lot is made of this fact that Max Verstappen doesn't quite stay on the track. Now, I mean, if you see the freeze frames, and we won't see them later, like Lando Norris is like pointed towards another postcode with his car, while Max Verstappen is like maybe a meter off track, something like that. It's not a wild move. It's absolutely not like out of control. So I don't find that very
On
compelling.
that point. But it would appear from the decision taken over the Norris-Verstappen incident that it's still the case that whoever is ahead at the apex is king. Verstappen and Red Bull team boss Christian Horner both pointed to Verstappen's penalty at the same track in 2017 when he lost a podium for passing Kimi Räikkönen outside of track limits. But that's a pretty meaningless comparison, as that was a simple case of a driver gaining a position by cutting a corner, the simplest of all track limit scenarios to judge.
Christian Horner did say, we've lost podiums. We've had, Max Verstappen pulled out of the cool down room, pulled off his own podcast for a penalty that he lost the podium over because the stewards gave him a penalty for whatever. And that's completely fair. I mean, Verstappen deserved that penalty and he got it and he had to serve it. I think the point was more, sometimes things break your way and sometimes they don't. And you can talk to the stewards about why, but you've got to cop it. I don't think it was, what about that time that we cut that corner and we got penalised and this is payback? It's nothing like that.
As is so often the case in F1, parts of the rulebook become overly complex because of the teams pushing for clear, black and white rules on everything. But something as dynamic as on-track combat doesn't lend itself to that, and those most affected by this, the competitors, have taken F1 down a route of preferring over-regulation versus placing more responsibility with the interpretation of the stewards on the day. Inevitably, the incident also led to calls for tracks to do away with asphalt runoffs and replace them all with gravel traps. But in this case, it's hard to see how that would have solved the problem. If there had been a gravel trap at the end of that straight, the battle probably plays out the same.
So weird that they're showing turn 12 here for some reason. I know there was an overtaking incident at turn 12, but that wasn't the flashpoint incident. So I'm not sure why they're talking about that. And people who were talking about putting asphalt kitty litter at the exit on outside of the track, people weren't talking about it here. They were talking about it at turn 1. But I mean, the argument of like, well, what would that have fixed? Well, I mean, it would have meant that Lando Norris couldn't try and throw it around the outside the way he did. Or, if the penalty for going around the outside is going to be so great, then there'd be more justification for changing the rule, which is what they're saying they want.
Except one or both cars end up in the gravel. Then any decision would be based on the same racing rules, so presumably Norris wouldn't be allowed to say he was forced into the gravel by Verstappen. He would just be told he wasn't entitled to space.
Yeah, but also, likewise, Verstappen couldn't dive in. I'm not saying he did this, but in theory, he couldn't dive in and be led on the brakes and just be like, I beat you to the apex, therefore I win. He wouldn't be able to do that because he would end up off track as well in the kitty litter. So he's sort of missing the point.
McLaren boss Andrea Stella called his team's interpretation of the incident polar opposite to the view of the stewards. He faced questions around why McLaren didn't order Norris to give the place back to let him have another chance to attack Verstappen, which is what Red Bull boss Christian Horner claimed he would have done if the roles were reversed, stating that he felt Norris would have had the pace to make the pass cleanly before the end of the race.
Things are going to get really funny here. And I think it's important context to remember too that Red Bull have just been scrutinized by the FIA, and there's been a lot of controversy about a part that they had on their car, which our rival team, McLaren, said to the FIA, hey, someone could cheat the way that Red Bull have, not saying they have cheated, but somebody who had this implementation that Red Bull have could in theory cheat. And the FIA agreed and made Red Bull change their car. I mean, I don't know what McLaren really want, but there's a war of words more broadly, especially from Zach Zaddy Brown, between the FIA to say this is no go.
But Stella said McLaren didn't give Norris that instruction because they were so sure Norris hadn't done anything wrong.
So this is funny. They were told the incident was being investigated by the stewards. What sometimes happens, and I think what normally happens is when something like this happens, a team is told and a driver is told, you have a choice. You will get a penalty or you can give the position back right now. And if you do that, things will correct themselves and we won't pursue anything. Andrea Stella is saying, we saw that this incident was going to be investigated and we assumed it was going to be a penalty for Max because he pushed Lando off the track. They were even telling Oscar Piastri, who was a bit further back, to speed up because if Max got a penalty, then we might have gained an extra position with Oscar Piastri. I mean, talk about a guy that just read it wrong and a team that just read it wrong. Lando Norris fans, McLaren fans. When you want to find out what's gone wrong here.
Stella even said he thought any investigation would be for Verstappen pushing Norris off the track, so McLaren instructed Oscar Piastri to get as close to Verstappen as possible in case he got a penalty after the race. Stella felt that if Verstappen had kept his car within track limits, then it would have been clear that Norris would need to give the place back. But
No, it doesn't matter. The problem is, Norris isn't entitled to leave the track and overtake any car ever. No car is entitled to do that. Now, the other question is, well, did he push him off the track? The problem is, like we've said, he was behind at the apex and he was overtaking around the outside. So there's no concept of being pushed off the track. That's just not a thing. So you've got to rule all of that out. Anthony Davidson did a good wrap up on the Sky Pad covering this, saying the only thing really that the stewards could look at Verstappen for is leaving the track, which, fine, he did. Drivers sometimes do that. Everybody's human. It happens sometimes. And if he goes off the track too many times and exceeds his limit and all the rest of it, he could potentially get a penalty for that. But it's not going to be a racing incident.
he felt the drivers were neutral on that front because they both went off track, so therefore one shouldn't be judged to have gained.
So look at this. I mean, I know that this is not, this isn't the worst of Verstappen being off the track, but like Norris is way out here. I mean, Verstappen's cutting in, yes, but I mean, he was never, I think he actually, at the worst point, still had his tyres on this curb or very close to this curb. If anyone can find anything where he's beyond the curb, let me know.
Because McLaren's view was that both drivers took advantage of going outside track limits. He also felt Verstappen disallowed the car on his outside to make a pass and called for statistics on how many times Max has used this way for defending.
Brilliant. This is the same as the Zach Brown thing. After appealing to the FIA, they're saying that Red Bull are cheating. Zach Brown was very seriously demanding that Red Bull staff and engineers sign affidavits declaring that they had never used this potential cheating mechanism. And now Andrea Stella is asking for, tell me how many times Max Verstappen has done this and gotten away with it. And it's like, yo, what? How many times Max Verstappen has not broken the rules? All of them. All the times where he didn't get a penalty, he obeyed the rules. Like, what do you want? What are you looking for here? I mean, this is what bad losing looks like.
But even if you don't like what Verstappen did, he's not really the bad guy here. He clearly has an understanding of what's allowed under the current rules, and he drives right up to the limit of those rules. Stella also criticised the stewards for rushing to make the decision in race rather than taking the time to talk to the drivers and spend longer looking at the data, given it was such a marginal call with potential championship implications.
There's a trend away from that, which I think is ultimately positive. There's a trend away from this idea of finishing a race and just not finding out for 6 hours later what the final standing is. I mean, these decisions can be appealed. Everybody in the moment, was kind of saying, this is pretty doubtful, everyone other than McLaren, I guess. Things can be appealed for that reason. So if you've got data that you think, absolves Lando, bring it to the table. That's what I would kind of say. For sure, there are times when stewards are better to not make a decision in the moment and see data and whatever, but I'm not sure this is one.
Perhaps that urgency was because the stewards didn't want to delay a decision that would affect who stood on the podium, or perhaps it was just because under their interpretation of F1's current racing rules, flawed as they might be, the outcome of any investigation was clear to them.
Flawed as they might be. So yet again, reinforcing this idea that the problem is with the rules. Not just, it didn't break Lando's way today. Not really copping it on the chin, just saying, nah, problems with the rules. And the FIA won't admit it. I don't know. That's my reading. What did you think of it? Let me know. Leave a comment, as they say. Hit me up on Threads. A lot of you already have. And remember, please keep it civil. If you see somebody, who you suspect might be new to Formula One, might be a Lando Norris fan who is just sounding off about their favorite driver being harshly dealt with, show some compassion. Try not to go in and explain to them why you think they're wrong. Let's all just be nice to each other. It won't be long until these cars are back on track and everyone will forget about it. So in the meantime, let's just try and keep it civil. See you next time.
Hey, there's Stewards here, and don't tell anybody. flash it down